Hi everyone, and welcome to my summary for the June solar eclipse that's happening on the 10th in Gemini. So I thought I would actually try and get my shit together and do this a little bit earlier than usual so that you've got a bit of time to prepare, because this is going to be an important eclipse. It starts a new 6-month cycle. So and I think it's important to kind of go into it consciously, because it's going to be a little bit of a tricky one. Now I should just say that I am going to be doing some in-depth eclipse horoscopes for members of my website. So if that's something that you're interested in, then think about signing up if you haven't already. Just go to astrologysphere.com/subscribe and you can sign up there. But please, just a heads up, if you are going to subscribe, please use your real name and surname, because I am trying to create a community of people where there's a lot of authentic sort of communication and interaction. So if you're not kind of up for that, then maybe this particular community is not for you. But anyway, let's get into this forecast and see what we have in store for us. Now, this particular solar eclipse happens in the 20th degree of Gemini, and the Sabian symbol for this degree is a cafeteria with an abundance of choices. So I find this really, really interesting, particularly if I think back to that quote of Tom Cheatham's about how we kind of live in this Hermes-ruled world, and this idea of ingesting things and of choice, which is very kind of Gemini, very Mercury-ruled. And what I also find interesting about this image is that it's about a gathering of people, and of course, certainly in the Northern Hemisphere, as we move into summer, there's kind of talk of opening things up like restaurants, bars, places where people can meet. So, I find this very interesting that we're sort of having this eclipse in this particular degree as we're kind of moving back into a more social sort of gear, but also because it's got this group element to it, which the lunar eclipse in Sagittarius also did with that Sabian symbol around a game of cricket. Now, of course, that was all about kind of teamwork, about the rules of the game, conduct, that sort of thing. This is more about the type of choices that we make in public domains, and also what we choose to ingest or focus on. And we'll see that this is going to be an important theme when we look at the human design. But I think overall, it's an interesting one. It's about society and the kind of overwhelming choices that we have. So it's kind of getting clear about what's for us, what works for us, and what doesn't. And here we're talking about clarity, that Gemini sense of clarity. It can also be about sometimes being a little bit greedy, on the kind of negative side. Sometimes we're spoiled for choice, so we just sort of we tend to sort of skim over the surface of things rather than going too deep, or we want everything instead of kind of getting clear about what discerning, kind of quality over quantity. So those may be some themes to consider now, as is the theme, as I say, of digestion. And of course there are many types of digestion. There's sort of mental digestion as well as kind of physical digestion. So I think this is going to be a time where we may be forced to slow down and to ruminate a little bit about certain things, particularly with Mercury being retrograde, and, with a lot of planets turning retrograde as we move into retrograde season. And that generally is when things start to sort of slow down in the outside world, and we're asked to kind of maybe become a little bit more introspective, or just review where we have, because we're almost halfway through the year, so it's good to sort of stop, pause, and see where we've come, how far we've come, what we've achieved in the last 6 months or so, and then kind of pivot, and then think about what we want to then do, or what we want to finish or accomplish as we move towards the second half of the year. So in terms of overall themes, there are a couple of things to be aware of. So as I said, the first thing is that we are starting a new 6-month cycle that will take us through to November, December, when we have our next set of eclipses. We closed out the previous cycle at the lunar eclipse in Sagittarius that happened, back in May. So this eclipse is in Gemini, which is an air sign. So this is yang energy, and air is an interesting one. It's not just about logic and the mental body. It's actually about exchange. If you think about air and the lungs, for example, the lungs almost become a way to interact with the environment, much the same as we do through our gut. So this is very much an element of exchange, and often when it's in Gemini, we're talking about an exchange of either money and skills, such as a marketplace, an exchange of some kind, or of ideas in the sense of a forum, a conference, a school, a university, a place of debate, you know, parliament, that kind of thing. So think about Albus in geomancy, and you kind of get an idea. So it's very interesting. You know, Gemini is a twin sign, it's a dual sign. So we are talking about dual energies here. Now this could work in a couple of ways. It could be that we're kind of reconciling or balancing two things that seem slightly opposite or jarring, and that's certainly a possibility with the Saturn-Uranus square, which we'll talk about in a minute. Or we could be balancing two things out, two opposites out in some way. Or alternatively, we may be juggling two things at once, you know, that kind of both and energy. So just something to bear in mind, because very often I find with Gemini energy, things come in twos, or we kind of do like we have two jobs, or you know, we do one thing by day and we do another thing on the side, or you know, so just and also this idea of exchange between parties, because air is actually the element of the heart. This is something that took me ages to kind of wrap my head around, and you see it more in the sign of Libra, which is also an air sign, and you know, which is about balance and about relationships. But you know, it is very much about the heart, which is close to the lungs, and I think it's important to bear that in mind, particularly when we get to the human design, because we are talking about the heart center, actually. This is where this eclipse is going to take place. Then this is a mutable sign, Gemini is mutable energy, and this is all about change and about shifts. It's also about a need to be adaptable, so plasticity is going to be an important quality now, particularly if circumstances become a little bit confusing, overwhelming, or chaotic, and there's certainly the propensity for that, which we'll kind of get into when we talk about the Saturn-Uranus square. So I think it's important to be as fluid as possible when it comes to changing circumstances now, and to try and go with momentum rather than try and swim upstream. You know, I think that's going to be an important quality now to avoid stress, is not to try and force things, or to have a very set idea of the way things need to turn out in order for you to feel 100% satisfied. You know, that in order to sort of thrive now, I think it's good to be open-ended and open-minded, and to be a little bit fluid. And then overall feel, Gemini is about a couple of things. Learning, number one, and I think students certainly have felt this over the last year or so, that ever since we started our new set of eclipses back in June 2020 with that lunar eclipse in Sagittarius, we've had to learn to be a little bit more adaptable, to kind of go with the flow and to sort of roll with the punches, if you like, you know, as everyday life continues to be disrupted. And you know, I think for students that's been particularly difficult. You know, one minute they're kind of going to school, the next minute they're at home having to do lessons on Zoom, parents having to sort of try and homeschool might not be their forte. So you know, that may be an issue that's highlighted over the next 6 months, as is travel, and here I'm thinking about Gemini, Boris Johnson, for example, and the fact that everything's supposed to open up on the 21st of June, but of course we're already seeing rumblings in the paper about how you know, the rise in this new variant of COVID may mean that gets delayed. So I think you need to just be a little bit, as I say, fluid, and bear this in mind when it comes to things like education and travel, learning and communication, particularly since we're heading into retrograde season. You know, that's normally starts in May, and usually over the summer most of the outer planets tend to go retrograde. So we're now in Mercury retrograde as well, so that's also going to key into this eclipse. So lots of kind of retrograde energy, which can be a little bit confusing and lead to miscommunication. So just something to bear in mind, you know, as we move into this new 6-month cycle. But on the positive side, retrogrades are excellent for kind of looking back and kind of rethinking, revising, reassessing, reviewing. So you know, it's a good time to kind of pause and look back and think, all right, well, how can I tweak something to make it better? You know, this didn't really work very well. Why? What can I do to sort of solve that problem? And also sometimes, you know, we get like fortuitous delays. So sometimes it can be a case of, you know, rejection is redirection. So, you know, don't necessarily get too frustrated if you think you're going in one direction and end up going in another. It may well be sort of divinely guided. So just something to bear in mind. And then key planets at this eclipse are going to be Mercury and Neptune, and we'll see why in a minute. The combination, because they are sort of hampered through the astrology, can lead to a little bit of confusion, deceit, trickery, possibly some scamming, and kind of imitation energy, so ideas theft, sort of hacking. I'm thinking about the solar wind hack that we had back in February, and we are having some themes that are going to be revisited now with that Saturn-Uranus square. So just something to bear in mind. I think, internet security is going to be important, making sure you have two-factor security. This element of two with Gemini, I think, is going to be important, so two-factor security. And also Neptune can make boundaries a little bit porous, so just something to bear in mind when it comes to communication, and again, things like security. On things like communications platforms, exchange platforms, so like crypto exchanges, banking, etc., etc. And then Saturn in Aquarius is also going to be a big theme. Saturn is currently retrograde in Aquarius, which is, it's good for restructuring, any type of restructuring that involves either time or groups, ideals or technology. Saturn is the ruler of time. It's also the ruler of structure and stability. So it may be at this time that we're kind of challenged to sort of make structures stronger, or to restructure elements of our life, or the way that we conduct our life, our lifestyle, or our schedules now, so that they can kind of roll with the punches if we have to make changes. So those are some of the overall themes, but let's have a look at the chart next and see what we can glean, in terms of more detail. So here we have the astrological chart for the solar eclipse in Gemini, and you can see that it happens on the 10th of June 2021 around about 11:52 BST, so that's British summertime. So of course, if that's not your time zone, then just use something like timeanddate.com to find out what time it will happen in your particular time zone. But you can see that it's a solar annular eclipse, which means that it's not total, and astrologically we can see that by the fact that the sun and the moon here are not exactly on the node itself, because the node is essentially, what it represents is the crossing of the paths of the sun and the moon. So total eclipses tend to happen exactly on the nodal axis. So that's why, it's fair to, we kind of know that it's an annular eclipse. But you can see the sun and the moon here in Gemini, and with them is Mercury. Now Mercury is of course the ruler of Gemini, so this is quite a strong placement for Mercury, but Mercury is retrograde. You can see that here by the R. So this already kind of gives us a flavor of what this particular eclipse is likely to be like energetically. When Mercury is retrograde, it does ask us to kind of slow down and review, so it's a good time to look back, to review certain facts, to review information. Perhaps new information comes into the public domain now that makes us rethink certain things, and in this respect it might have connections to that lunar eclipse that we just had in Sagittarius, which is of course the polar opposite sign to Gemini. But with a retrograde, there is always the possibility for misunderstandings, miscommunications, and for communication systems going awry. So we often see the banking, in the banking sector, that transactions tend to sort of go amiss. So you could see that system as being computers talking to each other. So it's a transaction that involves two parties. So anything like that, social media, things like Skype, Zoom, chats like WhatsApp, all of these could potentially either be disrupted on some level, so platforms could go down, or you could have miscommunications happening in that domain. And it's very easy, isn't it, when you're kind of typing, for people to misconstrue what you're saying. Not always the same as being able to hear somebody's tone of voice and that kind of thing. So just something to bear in mind, particularly if relationships are already a little bit fragile. Now this mix-up sort of energy is further emphasized by the fact that the sun and the moon are making a square to Neptune. Neptune's here in Pisces, and it's interesting because we had a similar signature last year at the lunar eclipse in Sagittarius, where Neptune was quite prominent. It was making a T-square to the nodal axis. And so just think back to then, when we did have quite a lot of confusion. There was a lot of fake news around, a lot of fear, uncertainty and doubt, a lot of confusing and conflicting information, supposed facts that turned out to not be facts. And I think we could have a rehash of that on some level. A lot of confusion, I think, also possibly around policies. So, travel policies, governments already talking about reversing, the lifting of travel restrictions because of, new cases being reported, that kind of thing. So I think we're going to see a lot of confusion, particularly around traveling, possibly delays, or having to cancel plans. So, I would advise, you to have travel insurance, and to have a plan B, because, it's very likely that we could see travel disruption in particular. Then, it can also produce it can sometimes be associated, when Neptune is negatively aspected and when Mercury are negatively aspected, both of them can be associated with theft and deception. So depending on where these planets fall in your chart, you may want to just be a little bit more vigilant than usual when it comes to things like internet security, online security, or Wi-Fi. Is it, a secure connection? Just beefing up on like two-step verification systems because of potential hacks, all that kind of thing, because there is the potential, and we have seen this in the last year, that this sort of the rate of online scamming has kind of gone through the roof. I've experienced that myself, discovering that somebody was sort of spoofing my domain and pretending to be associated with my website and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of it around, and I think just be extra careful over the next 6 months, when it comes to those kinds of things, fraud and deception. Just double check everything. Don't take anything at face value. Research. Don't click on links. All that kind of thing. But then more positively, we've got a trine happening between the luminaries and Saturn. Now, Saturn is here in the sign of Aquarius, but it's retrograde. So this is really about, I think, positive reviews involving systems or institutions that are ultimately, to our benefit. So, even though it might be a pain, let's say governments have to review their policies on certain things like travel, for example, it's ultimately aimed at the kind of the public good, and I need to try and protect as many people as possible. So just something to bear in mind. We do tend to sort of, particularly in the West, where we are so individual orientated, we do tend to kind of push back against authority, but just something to be aware of. But equally, this could also be about a review of certain technological systems that are perhaps not working or have failed on some level. Things like, for example, track and trace. The testing system here has certainly been quite faulty. So there could be some positive tweaks made to those systems, or just systems in general. Again, it will depend very much on where Saturn is transiting your chart as to what these structures or systems or institutions are likely to be about. Sometimes it's also about boundaries, personal boundaries, limitations. So setting certain limitations for ourselves in terms of the way that we use time, for example. Saturn here, being the planet that rules time. So it could be that we need to make some tweaks to the way that we prioritize certain things, or what we devote our time to. And equally, it could be about what we need to say no to. Maybe that also needs to change a little bit. When any planet is retrograde, it's a good opportunity to review. So, something to bear in mind. But yes, on the whole, it's also worth bearing in mind that Saturn is approaching its second square to Uranus here in the sign of the fixed sign of Taurus. So this is the second pass of this particular aspect. The first one was in mid-February, and there will be a last one in December, around about the 24th of December. So, in many respects, this is the kind of headline transit of 2021, much like the Saturn-Pluto conjunction was in 2020. So this is all about trying to kind of marry the new and the old. And of course, we know that isn't always a particularly easy task. Very often we want to try and incorporate some of the best of the old into the new, and there's a need not just to necessarily throw out the baby with the bathwater, but at the same time they may be resistant, to change, particularly from establishment figures, or people that are kind of stuck in tradition or feel comfortable within a certain way of doing things. So it can be a bit of kind of kicking and screaming. But whenever Uranus is involved, we are often talking about very sudden leaps forward, or kind of sudden paradigm shifts that can be a little bit shocking. And if we think that Taurus is, it's a sign to do with agriculture, banking, nature, and also financial security. So, a lot of people are talking about disruptive technology and how that is that particular phenomenon has been accelerated by this sort of what's happened in the last year, that we've needed technology to really advance when it comes to certain things like medicine, being able to sort of keep life ticking over while we're kind of all in lockdown and in separation. So, but of course that comes at a price. It means that certain jobs and industries and companies fall by the wayside, and that obviously has implications for people, particularly when it comes to money. So it's not always a kind of painless process, and I think just something to bear in mind during this year, when we have these occasional sort of jolts, that they can lead to an increase in fear, uncertainty and doubt. Any form of uncertainty is very disconcerting. So I think this is likely to be a time of transition this next 6 months, as we realize that perhaps in some ways life is never going back to the way that it was previous to 2020, and the implications of this, and also I think needing to have a plan B, a contingency plan, particularly when it comes to things like travel. So making sure you have insurance, that kind of thing, because I think there is the potential here for disruption and to for things not to go as planned. Now, what's interesting about this particular eclipse is that it forms part of a Saros family called 5 North by Bernadette Brady. So, I've kind of talked about this before, but eclipses happen in families. They happen every 18 and a half years. We get an eclipse in the same family. So this one harks back to 2003, so there may be links to events that happened in your life back then. You can see there have been other previous instances, 1985, 1967, 1945, and of course 1931. So, obviously 1945 being towards the end of or the beginning rather of the First World War, and 1931 being the year after the Great Depression. So there may be connections, to these historical events, just something to bear in mind as we kind of move forward and watch events unfold on the world stage. But on a more personal level, this particular Saros series is associated with sudden flashes of intuitive insight, so hunches, visions, prophetic dreams, that kind of thing. Also creative inspiration, channel information, kind of coming through that central channel, from the crown down into the third eye. So it could be a time when you receive a lot of intuitive hits and messages in your dreams, for instance. And I think it's really important to pay attention, because, as I say, it's going to be quite confusing in the outside world with all that kind of Mercury retrograde and Neptune square energy. So I think it's going to be really important to be able to tune into your internal GPS system and to messages coming through from your higher self and your guides, via things like, dreams and channel information. So I think really pay attention and kind of write these things down, because you might find that it could provide you some shortcuts, ways to sort of to kind of push through any confusion or uncertainty. If you're not really sure how to move forward, you might discover shortcuts, using this particular method. So now we come to the fixed star aspects. And it's quite interesting. We've got the Moon and Mercury making a conjunction to a fixed star called Bellatrix. Now, we did have this last year as well, I think around about the time of the Venus retrograde. So you may find that some themes from Venus retrograde kind of come up again now. Perhaps, as you sort of integrate or realize that you've learned certain lessons, or perhaps, a lesson kind of comes around again just to test to see whether you've learned it. But essentially, this is the star in the left arm of Orion, and of course Orion is the hunter or the shepherd, and we did talk about Orion a little bit at the time as well, particularly around kind of starseed calmer and that kind of thing. So if you're interested in that, then go back to the post that I did on the Orion Gateway, because we will be opening up the gateway. Well, the gateway is kind of opening up now as the sun moves into the stars of Orion. So just something to bear in mind. You can see the sun here at the time of the eclipse will actually be in the horns of Taurus, because of course we're talking about the sidereal zodiac, the star zodiac, which is one sign behind the tropical zodiac, which is solar. It's based on the divisions of the ecliptic. So we can see the sun, Mercury, and the moon here in the horns of the bull, and but they are making a parallel to Orion, which is here. So just you can see Orion is facing the bull, and so this is a very interesting star, actually. It kind of has to do with the female warrior. So it was called the Amazon star because it derives from the Arabic name for the star called Al-Najid, which means the conqueror, but the Latin name for it was Bellatrix, which is female warrior. So there's an interesting kind of binary going on here, where we're kind of combining opposites, and I think it reflects that slightly jarring quality of the Saturn-Uranus square, where opposite energies are almost sort of forced together, where we're kind of asked to put unlikely things together that might on the face of it not seem to fit. So the left arm of Orion is of course the left hand of darkness in terms of Western binaries, so you can see why it's associated with the feminine, and then of course we are talking about the left arm of a warrior. So this is really about learning to kind of conquer things, but in a slightly unusual way. So it could be success by working outside of the usual norms and conventions, which would be very in keeping with that Saturn-Uranus square. But equally, it can be about success through overcoming your shadow side, conquering your demons. So it could be more about an internal battle rather than an external battle. And of course, when planets are retrograde, that is certainly a possibility that these things can kind of play out more internally rather than externally. So as I said, it could be about challenging norms or reversals or inversions. So, for example, a female warrior seems incongruous. We tend to associate here in the West, the warrior with the male energy, which was quite strong at the lunar eclipse, actually, with that focus on Chiron, and particularly Chiron being in Aries. But now we're kind of asked to consider the way that we put things together, because, perhaps it's a case of making assumptions. Why do we assume that females can't be warriors? So we may be asked to question things like gender stereotyping, for example. I'm thinking also of Thomas Wood's characterization of the fixed star Bellatrix as being somebody with a sharp tongue, in the case of a female, with that kind of Gemini energy. But then in the male, it's seen as associated with the sharp sword, and kind of military prowess. So there are kind of certain cultural overlays to these symbols that we perhaps need to question. And I think you might find that in your own life. For example, I've seen it certainly in the crypto space. I've seen a lot of comments like, Bitcoin has become, sort of certainly become like a contraceptive. We've seen women acting like men, and I think, it's an interesting concept that, because women want to sort of secure their own financial future, and that they see themselves as equal to men when it comes to being able to read charts or to make investment decisions. I'm thinking here, for example, of ARK Investments' Cathy Wood and how much flack she gets, and I'm sure she wouldn't get as much flack if she wasn't a woman. So I think it's time to kind of question some of these cultural assumptions and norms, and that may be where, again, the Saturn-Uranus energy is kind of called into play. But equally, it could be about leadership or self-empowerment that comes about by facing up to one's inner demons. And again, this is something I want to really talk about when we get to the human design, because it's a huge theme, actually, when we look at where this particular eclipse happens in the energetic body. But then the final word is, if we consider that the moon and Mercury are making this parallel to Bellatrix, then I think what we need to consider is that we may want to help others or bring about improvements, perhaps on the collective level, but we may need to have a very clear plan and a well thought through campaign or strategy, much like, if you think about military strategy. And I think with all of the disruptions that are likely, during this period, there may be a call to sort of revisit those plans, just to sort of make sure that they are 100% kind of watertight. Now, as usual, you're probably wondering where this particular solar eclipse happens, because it does start a new 6-month cycle, not just for the collective, but for, all of us individually. So again, I've created a little cheat sheet for you so that you can see exactly where this eclipse will be happening, and therefore which area of life is likely to be highlighted for you in terms of, needing to sort of press the reset button. So rather than as opposed to last time where you're looking at 2 houses, this time you're just looking at 1, because the sun and the moon are on the same side of the earth. So just look for your rising sign, and then this will tell you which area of life is likely to be highlighted for you. As I said, I'm going to be doing some eclipse horoscopes for members of my website, so if you want something that's a little bit more in depth, then consider subscribing by going to astrologysphere.com/subscribe. But for the rest of you, I invite you to pause the video and just have a look at the chart to see, to kind of get a quick grasp on what may be where you might be starting a new 6-month cycle. So yeah, that's, I think, all I really want to say. I don't want to make this too long, but I think a very, very interesting time, certainly. And if you are interested, as I say, in getting access to my newsletter, and from there the horoscopes and things that I do for members, then do go to astrologysphere.com/subscribe and sign up, and you can become part of the the special VIP community that we have, off social media, something just a little bit more intimate.